We're joining three truly remarkable photographers, Cory Richards, Mads Peter Iversen, and Chris Burkard. They're going to give us their secrets for outstanding outdoor photography.
There's always a level of preparation. I mean, if you walk outside and you brought a camera with you, you're in some way prepared, right? If you put a battery in that camera, you're even more prepared. So for me, the first component is preparedness. Like, if you want to capture a great image, imagine if it's sunrise and you're in New Zealand and it's beautiful, and the night before you were shooting time lapses or long exposures and you have an ISO 4000 on your camera. So I'm saying here is, in the evening before, you need to be prepared for what that morning is going to look like. Taking that moment, that time to prep yourself and your equipment so that you can literally push the trigger button. And maybe the camera is set up at ISO, 100 at f11 at 2/50th of a second. So it's just ready for the morning. Preparedness is one of the big things. I would say the second thing is be willing to evolve. Be willing to not be so sticking to your guns, that you're and your creative vision, that if something else happens, if something new occurs, you can't shift and or kind of evolve that focus of what you're doing, right? To me, that's really important, because there's a lot of moments where I've been so just, the idea is so baked in my mind that I'm not accepting of anything new. So I think being able to evolve and being able to shift, and that comes with a bit of time and energy to realize maybe that your creative process, my creative process, isn't always the perfect one. Like being open to new things that might come in, and that's really how I think great images are created. Like if you go to the beach and you have a vision for how this shot's going to be, but really the shot is 200 feet down the beach or on a cliff, be able to move, be willing to move, and be willing to sacrifice something to do so. And I would say the third thing is always asking yourself, what's the story, right? What's the story?
Right on.
And from the moment you leave the car, or the moment you leave your house, or the moment you get on the plane, what's the story? What's the story I'm trying to tell here? And I'm not saying that every photograph needs to be this deep, complicated story, but in many ways, it's important to recognize that you have the ability to say something more meaningful than what the image can say, which really is the story behind the photograph. And I hope that people can start to consider that a lot.
That is really, all those points are really good advice. On the preparedness, Ansel Adams said, chance favors the prepared photographer. It's actually a quote from Louis Pasteur said, chance favors the prepared mind. And Ansel Adams just changed it to the prepared photographer. And he two of his most iconic images, one is Moon over Half Dome and the other one is the moon shot in New Mexico, were both taken absolutely at a moment's notice.
Yeah, I love that story about him just jumping out of the car and setting. He had like 20 seconds. But how cool is it that his most profitable image, as well as his most well-known image, his most recognized, that was the byproduct of having done that so many times, where he could jump out of the car and compose a beautiful photograph and not be flustered. It's such a, it's a telling thing.
It is absolutely, and, on the other side of that, he would spend 9 hours waiting for the clouds to move in a certain spot. But again, That's another way of being prepared.
Totally.
Good advice. Okay, well, listen, we're going to look at some of your images here in a second, but in terms of, you probably have already answered this, but in terms of getting an image that is really going to grab people emotionally, any particular advice for that?
Yeah, the light plays such a huge role. I lend towards wanting to shoot more silhouettes. The reason I love shooting silhouettes is because there's a sense of anonymity in the image that allows the viewer to then put themselves into that position, right? So there's a relatability to shooting a photograph that is in some way shot during those first 20 minutes of sunlight or those last 20 minutes of sunlight. And that's the golden hour, right? But
Yeah.
even more important than the golden hour is the fact that when you're shooting a subject where you can't really see the face, you can't really see the logos, you can't really see the clothing, all of that becomes unimportant, and all you're focused on as the viewer is the action. What's happening? What am I seeing in this image? Can I relate to it? Do I relate to the movement, the motion, the light? And so I think that for me, I aim to shoot images that the viewer can really insert themselves into. And I guess to really boil it down, if you were to take the idea of shooting a silhouette and then shooting a relatable image, you're kind of putting it into this one terminology where you want to shoot a photograph that's timeless. And that's really what it's all about. And I mean that in the truest sense, that you can't date the image. If the image feels like 1967 or 2020, great. It should feel like it could happen anywhere, anytime. I think that's really nature in its purest form. And I really aim to shoot photographs that strike that fine balance. And that to me is how you create an emotional image.
This photo was taken, you know, I would say directly after, but it wasn't seconds after. After we had dug ourselves out, all three of us nearly died.
Wow.
But we all survived. And this photo was taken shortly after that.
What were you using at the time? What were you shooting it with?
You know, it was actually a point and shoot camera, because my bigger camera had died. And so it was gosh, I forget even which camera it was. But it was just it was a pocket camera that
point and shoot. Wow, isn't that amazing?
Yeah, and I could. The original image is actually a JPEG. It wasn't set to RAW. I just had the camera around my neck because the other big camera the batteries were done. There was ice and fog and condensation in the lenses and the body, and this had sort of survived this 6-day sprint to the top of the mountain. And I remember pulling it out and actually thinking about the focal length that I wanted. So I just zoomed, it had a sort of an electronic zoom.
Yeah.
And you could watch the lens telescope. And I knew roughly where I wanted it, which was about 50 millimeters. And just turned it on myself and held it out with a straight arm in front of me and shot several frames.
So you said this is the peak down the valley a little bit.
Yeah, this is a mountain called Ama de Blam. Ama de Blam is it's been called the most beautiful mountain in the world. It is iconic for sure. This is a less familiar angle of the mountain. There's a more familiar angle where, if we were to show it, people would go, "Oh yeah, that mountain." It's been referred to as the Matterhorn of the Himalaya. Mm-hmm. It's just a iconic mountain because of its shape, and from every angle it seems to have this geometry that speaks to grandeur. It's not something that falls away or is sort of lost amongst the other mountains. It sticks up and stands out, and because of that, it's become almost a symbol of what mountains are and what mountains can be and the mystery that mountains hold. And I was walking over a pass. Actually, no, I believe this was taken from a base camp on another mountain, on an opposing mountain, and the clouds just sort of opened up briefly as they were swirling around the summit, and I was able to get a couple frames of this moment that to me spoke to exactly that emotive quality that this mountain sort of is celebrated for. It's big, it's scary, it's ominous, but at the same time it's representative of something beautiful and I think innately human, which is that desire, that need, that want to discover. And for some of us, that has been, most easily manifested through climbing to the highest point we can find and looking out and surveying the landscape around us. For other people, that is most easily manifested by paddling out into the ocean.
Yeah. Well, the triangle is a symbol of strength and stability, and that's what you see here. Again, a lot of geometry. You're in the foreground, and there's 1, 2, 3 prominent projections coming through. Lots of geometry. I'm a huge fan of geometry. You know, in my composition book, I wrote about Henri Cartier-Bresson. Basically said that geometry is a pleasure for him because you're really tying all these different elements together. And you obviously use a lot of geometry as well. But tell me about this image.
Yeah, I completely agree. When I talk about composition too, and it's also something I talk about in my newest ebook, is geometry. Think geometry when you are out, because that's more or less the best way to make an aesthetically pleasing composition. Think in geometry and geometrical shapes. So yeah, this photo here is from the Faroe Islands also. And yeah, these are background islands, and they really stand out like that. It's a single exposure, just straight on it. Okay. And I'm using what is probably equal to about 400 or 500 millimeter to get this very strong compression.
I thought so. Yeah, I mean, looking at it, obviously those islands are, you know, they're compressed together, but that's a really amazing effect.
Yeah, from the foreground to the furthest away background island, I think there's about 20 or 25 kilometers.
I love the way you're silhouetted. I love the way you're capturing yourself in your images. You know, I've never done that. It's fantastic. When did you start that? I think that, first of all, let me just say this. I find that a landscape with a person in it is much more interesting than a landscape by itself, for many reasons. One, we as human beings, we like to see another human being, but it also gives you the scale. So when you're inserting, but we don't often have other people around. So I never figured out what you have done. But when did you start doing that, putting yourself in your images?
It's something I have been doing for some years now, but it has really taken off in 2019, and especially to use myself as scale, not just as a person in the photo to make like an adventurous feeling, but really to emphasize scale. I've really been doing that for the past year or so, maybe a little bit further back, 1.5 years. And
it's a really strong compositional point that I also included in my book, and Bob Holmes, National Geographic photographer, calls it punctuation. And by putting that punctuation point, it really makes the image pop. I mean, it would be an interesting image by itself, but it completely changes the way you feel about it when you see you, and especially I think being silhouetted. So that's brilliant.
Yeah, you even have like in this case here, and that wasn't on purpose when I posed for the photo, but I'm kind of posing in the same way as that background small C-stack, which is actually called the wedge, that C-stack. So it looks as if I'm like mirrored in that background C-stack. So that's like an extra thing on top of it.
It's always great having you guys with us. It means so much to me to have your support. Hey, listen, if you haven't already done it, please subscribe, enable the bell, like the video, share with your friends. We want to get these videos out to the whole world. Leave your comments. I read every one of them. I try to respond to them all. And listen, stay safe, stay well, and remember to get out and capture your own images of life.